This is Made for More Living with Johnny Jennings, powered by eXp Realty. Online at madeformoreliving.com.
If you are thinking about buying or selling a home, we have the show for you today. We're going to be covering the topic that most people overlook, and it costs them thousands of dollars when buying or selling a piece of real estate. With us today, we have Matt Singer with Good Life. Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, greetings, everybody. Thanks for having me. I've been in the industry for 10 years. I kind of did it backwards. Started in the management side for 5, and then decided that it was easier to clean up my own problems than other people's problems. So I went into the inspecting, doing the termite or pest inspections for escrow transactions. And I've been doing that for almost 6 years now. With Good Life Inspections, we're a bigger group of 4 different companies, all construction related. I work for the inspection division, Good Life Inspections. We formerly were North American Home Services.
Got it. So you've been doing this a while, at least 6 years on the inspection side?
Yep.
And so what are some of the craziest things? So you've been in and out of houses all day long for the last 6 years. What are some crazy things that you've seen when inspecting properties?
I've seen a lot of crazy things. So it's like take your pick. I know there's one that's in particular that in Granite Bay, it was a fairly large listing. It was over $1 million. The owner had to move for business, and we did an inspection of the house. It was, I think, a 6,000 square foot house with a really fancy facade. It was all brick and slate stone. And during the inspection, we found some warped, like, windowsills. And there's a certain amount of warping that's normal, which is wear and tear. That's like a fiberboard product, so it's pretty susceptible to moisture. But these ones were fairly bad, and that's an indication that the windows have failed, like they're leaking into the house or into the wall. And this was also facing south, which is the weather side of the house, so it's getting direct rain on basically everything, right? And you get on the other indirect weather sides, they're not getting that direct water contact. So we went under the house. There was, some evidence of water in the sub area. It was insulated, so you had these insulation battens covering a lot of stuff up. We opened up an area as like a further inspection to see what we're dealing with. Yeah. And it turns out that the majority of the front of this house, that the lower level windows had all been leaking, and we had to deconstruct the whole front of the house. And then it led into a brick facade that was an archway that was super technical. And I mean, long story short, it was a 2-month repair.
Wow.
2-month repair was $120 grand.
$120,000 repair.
Oh yeah. And it was.
So when you first saw the warped windows,
yep,
what was your thought? Like, this is how much, like, what did you think it was going to be?
My first thought was, oh no.
Oh gosh.
And then after that, it was, this could be like a $60,000 job, just because the siding was so difficult, because then we have to put it back together and match. Mm-hmm. So taking it apart, we're going to try and salvage what we can salvage, because finding matching material is difficult.
So was that an issue when it was first constructed? They built it poorly, or what was the problem?
They had brick windowsills on the outside, so that's pretty heavy, right? And then you flash a window when you put it in, but that flashing is going to last so long. And then when they did this brick, they put a right angle, like a piece of steel right angle metal to support the bricks so they wouldn't sag. And eventually over time, when it's getting hit with the sun, so the house is expanding and contracting with the heat, and then you got water also being introduced for the winter period, it just sprung a leak. And then that water is just constantly testing that flashing. And flashing around a window is not like metal. They're using like a mastic or like a building paper type material. So over time, you get that wet and then dry it out, wet and dry it out. It becomes brittle, cracks, and then boom, you got water in a wall.
Wow.
So when I first saw it, I was like, okay, hopefully this is, just like somebody sleeps with the windows open. And once we opened it up, that wasn't the case.
Oh my gosh. So when you saw that, did you think, is this like, were the buyers expecting something of this magnitude?
The buyers were not.
Did the sellers know that there was an issue?
The seller was not as well. And he bought the house 3 years previously and had an inspection. And I'd say that condition had been there at least 5 years. The amount of damage that it had done, you're talking, at least 5 years of moisture exposure. We're only getting rain a couple months a year.
Yeah. So the inspectors he had out when he bought the home, who is now the homeowner.
Yep.
The inspectors did not catch this.
They missed it. And they had plantation shutters. So it's just on the south side and the west side. I mean, Good Life, we pride ourselves on the thoroughness of our inspections. So, our guys are trained, but when you have these plantation shutters, you don't need to necessarily open them all, but on the south and the west side of the house, those are the direct weather sides. It really, you should, because you find something like this. You either see it from the outside, and if you don't open those shutters, you miss it. And that would have been a $120,000 miss that a buyer would have been saddled with.
So what ended up happening with the buyers and sellers on that?
Well, in that case, the buyer really wanted the house, and they had actually prematurely removed contingencies. So he was in. He couldn't leave.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Woo. And then the guy selling the house was an attorney for a mining company. So he was astute at law. And he agreed to cover, I think it was 50 to 60,000. So then we had this, windfall of like 70 grand or 60 grand. And so we had to, there was quite a bit of going back and forth.
Yeah.
We opened some more stuff up just to make sure we knew like what exactly we were estimating. It turns out that the seller was actually a pretty, level-headed guy, and they split it.
That's cool.
Interesting.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it was unfortunate. It's not one of those things that we're looking forward to. Because, I was there weekends. I met so many people at that house and walked it so many different times that.
And that's unusual, too, that the seller would be willing to play ball.
Especially without contingency. Like with contingencies removed, the buyer was in.
Yeah, if you're listening to this and if you're selling a house or you're buying a house and and the buyer has removed their contingencies, right, that buyer is locked in. They have to move in on that home. Yep. They have to perform, or they lose their deposit potentially.
Yep.
And so it's which do you want?
I've seen others similar to that where they neglected to do a pre-list inspection to understand the house before they marketed, and then they do inspections, right? And you're on this timeline. You're on an escrow timeline. So you now have a deadline that this stuff has to get done.
Yep.
So we go doing inspections, and it turns up, some substantial findings, like over 10 grand. And now if they had leverage, it's now moved over to the buyer side because you have these larger repair conditions that need to be addressed.
Yeah. So the Granite Bay story, that's an incredible story.
Yeah.
Warped windows turned into $120,000 in damages. But like, what's more common? Like, 'cause as a real estate agent, when I see decking, I'm like, oh boy, here we go.
You're not the only one.
Yeah. What do you see when you see a deck?
When I see a deck, the first thing I see is what side of the house is it on, and is it covered? Covered decks, like if they have a patio cover, any kind of cover to deflect weather, they tend to be in better shape. And then, obviously the side or the orientation of the deck matters. If the south side or west side decks, they tend to be damaged more often because they're exposed to the weather more, right?
Yep.
If you're on the north or the east side, you're opposite weather. So they don't get hit quite as hard. They don't get that direct sunlight. So what we see normally is surface fungus, which doesn't mean that the wood has to be removed, right? It just means it has to be scratched off and treated with a fungicide. So that's like best case scenario. What's more common is we'll find sections of the deck where either the decking is damaged or it's an indication of the joisting, like the framing, the structure of the deck is damaged. And the thing with decks is once you start taking them apart, you have a lot of wood to wood connection, and you start deconstructing, and it just turns into a can of worms. So it's like, it's no inspectors don't like looking at decks either, because we know how it fits into deals, and it can definitely change the landscape or end at escrow.
Correct. Yep. So decks are a problem, and then a lot of people are surprised to hear that there's termites in the area.
Yes.
Right? So how often do you run into that? What does that look like?
Well, Sacramento is, if you didn't know, Sacramento is a termite prone area. We're in the valley. We have rivers, all that stuff. And it used to be a lot of orchards. So you got a lot of wood in the ground. Our most common termite is subterranean termites. There's like a part frog, part termite. Anyways, so subterranean termites are the most common. They live in the ground, come out of the soil, feed on the wood, and then take it back into the ground. There's a misconception. People hear termites and they tend to panic. It's not optimal. You don't want termites.
Sure.
But the average treatment for eradicating termites is about $1,200 to $1,500 if you have a standard size house. And the good thing about termites is once you treat the house, the termites stop doing damage. Dry rot's not quite like that. So, what I tell people when we're doing walkthroughs and you find termites is like, look, I understand that there's a stigma and, the word termite can be a trigger, but realistically, it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
Like dry rot can be much worse. It's an infection, right? So termite damage, you stop the termites, you stop the damage, you can reinforce that wood. It doesn't have an infection that's going to continue to spread. Dry rot, on the other hand, has to be removed and replaced. You can't reinforce it. You have to take it out and then put something new back in.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. It's people tend to look over dry rot and they focus on termites when the reality is, unless termites have been at a property for a long time, they usually don't do very much damage.
Termites and mold, you know?
Yep.
Yeah.
And we don't say that word because you have to have a license.
Yeah. You can't say the M word. Can't say the M word. But people, it's black mold. I don't think so.
Tell you that.
I don't think so. It looks more like mildew to me. But so many people freak out. And the hard thing about a lot of these inspections, if you haven't done the pre-list, which we'll talk about in a later segment, but it's unknown to the seller. The seller can only disclose what they know. And the buyer's getting these reports from companies like yours, Good Life, where they're like, what? This is insane. How did the seller not know? And so it's a total game changer, because how do you know if there's subterranean termites in your house? Like, how would you tell how would you tell?
Well, an array's found, you really only a pest inspector or a termite inspector is going to know that. And what happens a lot with the sellers is they'll have normal pest control. And so they think that is a way to maintain the house. Those guys are looking for just bugs. We have different licenses. So pest control guys have a license to call out or, write recommendations based on rodents, ants, things like that. They aren't trained in dry rot or fungus, and they're not trained in termites. So they're not looking for those things. So if you have pest control and you think that they're checking your house out like that, they are not. And we'll see people who think, oh, we have normal pest control we have for 5 years. The house is pristine, right? And that's not the case. In a raised foundation, meaning, it's got a concrete perimeter footing that the house is built on, and then underneath the house is an open area or a void. Those homes, really, you should have them inspect every 3 to 5 years, because termites can show up anywhere, and usually they'll come up in the sub area because it's darker, it's not hot, right? It's usually pretty moist or wet, and so that's like the conditions that they prefer. In a slab house, this is my personal experience, 90% of the time in a slab house, if you have termite infestation, it's going to start on the firewall in the garage.
Really?
There's 2 different slabs. You have a garage slab that's, poured and engineered to carry a car and, the structure. The main slab of the house is just meant to carry people, their furniture, and the house. So they have an expansion joint between the 2 slabs. And for whatever reason, the termites, they find that joint, and it's a hop, skip, and a jump right into the wall.
Wow.
So like 90% of the time, if you have a slab, the firewall or the common wall between the house and the garage, that's usually where you want to focus.
Got it. And so by focus, you mean just doing your inspections or treating the wood?
If you're just living in the house, right? I mean, a lot of people will have a fridge in there and they'll store their sports gear and all that stuff. So you really can't see the concrete or the curb, the base of the wall in the garage because it's obstructed. But if you were, attuned to that and hyper diligent about your house, you could check on that every so often and just go along and look at the curb and try and identify. I mean, they're pretty distinct mud tubes. And, you're not going to have mud or dirt in your garage like that. It's like on the wall, it's in a tube, it's pretty obvious. And you can just go online and check out what mud tubes look like or subterranean termite tubes and have an idea.
So you see them and you're like, uh-oh, what do I do?
And then you call
Good
termite
Life.
company. Yeah, call Good Life, and we'll come out and give you a good deal on getting rid of them.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for sharing some of those stories. Coming up next, we're going to be talking about the dark underbelly of inspection companies, because there are some things you need to look out for. Coming up fast.
So if you're listening to today's show and you're wondering what kind of offers could Johnny Jennings and the Tom Daves team get me for my home right now, easy way to find out, give Johnny Jennings a call at 855-TOM-DAVES. Better yet, go to the website tomdaves.com, type in your address, Bam! Right away, you find out what kind of offers you would get, the low and high end, and how much you would get if you wanted a cash offer today, no matter what kind of condition your home is in. The website again is TomDaves.com.